Um, my name is Uday Mehta. I teach political philosophy at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. I'm very happy to be moderating this panel, which is called Is American Exceptionalism a Force for Moral Good? What I think, since we're running a bit late, I'll do is I'll just very briefly introduce the three speakers and the commentator, and then we'll proceed in the order that they are listed in the program. Our first speaker is David Bromwich, who's a professor, a Sterling Professor of English at Yale. He's the author of several books, most recently, Intellectual Biography of Edmund Burke, and a set of essays called The Moral Imagination. He will be followed by Amity Shlaes, who's a best-selling author of the book The Forgotten Man, A History of the Great Depression. She will be followed by Jim Sleeper, who teaches at Yale and is the author of The Closet of Strangers, Liberalism and the Politics of Race in New York, and Liberal Racism. And the commentator is Joan Richardson, my colleague at the Graduate Center, who's a professor of English and comparative literature, and the author of Pragmatism and the American Experience. So, David Bromwich. Each speaker will speak for 10 to 15 minutes.
This will be more like 15 minutes, but I'll go fast, and I've tried to write it clearly. And the remarks that follow are polemical to a degree and rather dry and didactic. The title of our panel asks a plain question, and I'll answer it quickly before trying to answer it slowly. To make an exception of yourself is as immoral a proceeding for a nation as it is for a person. When we save a person, usually someone who's going off the rails, he thinks the rules don't apply to him. We mean that person is a danger to others and perhaps to himself. The reason is that he's made an exception of himself. People who act on this belief don't examine themselves deeply as a rule or write a history of the self to justify the belief that they are unique. There's very little effort involved in their willfulness, and I think this is the best description one can offer of the syndrome, an excess of will unaccompanied by awareness of the need for self-restraint. Such people are monsters. Many of them land in asylums, more perhaps in prisons. But at the luckier reaches of the class, we also find many high-functioning autistics, governors, generals, corporate heads, and owners of professional sports teams. Nations, on the other hand, do write their own histories. It's expected of them. This is normally a record of justified conduct, actions worthy of celebration. Exceptional nations, therefore, are compelled to engage in some fancy bookkeeping, which exceptional individuals can't avoid, or avoid anyway until they are put on trial or subjected to interrogation under oath. The exceptional nation will claim that it is not responsible for its exceptional character. Its nature was given by God, or history, or destiny. An external and semi-miraculous instrumentality is invoked and is believed to carry the burden of an anomaly that defies merely scientific understanding. Variants and synonyms of the word providence often get slotted in, a word that picked up its extreme utility in this context at the end of the 17th century, the start of the epoch of nations formed by supposed covenant or compact. Providence, the word, and the idea, splits the difference between the accidents of fortune and purposeful design, a handy piece of verbal machinery if you're bent on self-deception. Why is it not moral for a person to treat himself as exceptional? Because morality, by definition, means a standard of right and wrong that applies to all persons without exception. But to shorten the answer this much may be to oversimplify. I think, in fact, the word exceptionalism has become much more current, to pick a rough number, since the year 2001. I think the word exceptionalism and the idea in the popular press and in demagogic minds draws its appeal from the fact that it is ambiguous between three distinct senses. First, a nation is thought to be exceptional by its very nature, nature so consistently high, worthy, and enviable that these qualities shine through all its deeds, and one simply can't imagine not justifying and admiring, and if one is a foreigner, wishing to belong to the nation. My country, right or wrong, is the proper sentiment to hold about such a nation, because in fact we can't conceive of its being wrong. In a second sense of exceptionalism, the nation is thought to be circumstantially admirable. It has demonstrated its exceptional quality by adherence to ideals that are at once peculiar to its original character and broadly appreciable as part of the human inheritance. Not my country, right or wrong, but a more thoughtful sentiment is here brought into play. We love our nation, it is said, not for what it is, but for what it can be. The evidence in ideals of all that it can be forms a historical deposit which has left a rich residue in the present. These are the two main forms of exceptionalism, really, and I'll spend most time on them, but I want to hold in reserve and say a final word about an exceptionalism fairly common in America in these times and common among ethnic groups and religious communities in our country. Exceptionalism in this third version renounces all pretense of argument and falls back on an appeal to a sentiment which is felt to be necessary and inescapably human. My nation is exceptional to me just because it is mine. Its familiar habits and customs have shaped the way I think and feel beyond any wish to extricate myself from its demands. The nation on this last view is like a family, and we owe it, just as we owe the members of our family, unconditional love. That phrase is often used. Unconditional love. In that sense, how can our own nation help being exceptional to us? Athens was an exceptional nation or city-state, as Pericles described it in his oration for the first fallen in the Peloponnesian War. He meant his description of Athens as exceptional to carry both normative force and a hortatory urgency. Athens is the greatest of Greek cities and shows it by its works, by the greatness of its deeds, by the structure of its government, and by the character of the citizens who are themselves creations of the city. At the same time, Pericles is saying to the widows and children of the war dead, resemble them, be like these brave dead. Do more of what they have done. Seek to deserve the name of Athenian as these dead have deserved it. This great oration is careful first to praise the ancestors of Athenian democracy who by their exertions made it exceptional. And I'm going to proceed here a bit with a mixture of quotation and paraphrase of that very famous speech, which is in Thucydides' history of the war with Sparta. They dwelt in the country, says Pericles of the ancestors, they dwelt in the country without break in the succession from generation to generation and handed it down free to the present time by their valor. Yet we who are alive today, it seems to say, have also added to that inheritance. And he goes on to praise the constitution of the polis, which, quote, does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Little American echoes in that. In our enterprises, still a quotation, we present the singular spectacle of daring and deliberation, each carried to its highest point and both united in the same person. As a city, we are the school of Hellas. That is to say, no representative man from another city will be so resourceful as one of ours. Athens alone of all cities is greater than her reputation. We choose to die by resisting rather than live by submitting. Indeed, the greatness of a polis constituted of freemen is proved by this very willingness to die. And Pericles turns to the survivors with an evocation of the prodigy of nature that has brought them forth, and which they alone must now represent. Speaking to the widows and children of the war dead, the first war dead, you must yourselves realize the power of Athens and feed your eyes upon her from day to day, till love of her fills your hearts, and then when all her greatness shall break upon you, you must recognize that it was by courage, sense of duty, and a keen feeling of honor in action that men were enabled to win all this. So resonant are their deeds that the memory of their greatness is written in the hearts of men in faraway lands. Quote, for heroes have the whole earth for their tomb. Very similar to what General MacArthur wrote about the great dead of the wars from West Point. You can see it inscribed on a little monument there. Heroes have the whole earth for their tomb. That is Athenian exceptionalism at its height. And again, notice it is the deeds of war that are felt to prove the worthiness of the human works of the city apart from war. Athens is placed beyond comparison. Nobody who knows Athens and knows other cities will fail to recognize its character as the exception among all. This is an overmastering sensation that carries conviction with it. The greatness of the city breaks upon you. Compare this praise of the exceptional political order with a partly similar invocation of a national past by Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln was speaking not of a war against a rival city, but as he described it, against part of one's own that had broken off. And the common commitment he recalls found expression in a single document, Declaration of Independence, that codified the high ideals of the state and inspired a framework of laws, the Constitution, that would allow those ideals to be realized over time. Athens for Pericles is what Athens always has been. The Union for Lincoln is what the Union still is going to be. This is, if you will, my second type of exceptionalism. He explicitly associates the greatness of our past intentions, we hold these truths to be self-evident, with a resolution that he asks his listeners to declare with him in the present moment of sacrifice. It is not for the noble dead, but rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. Artificial weights will at last be lifted from all shoulders. After the war, there will be a popular government and a political society based on the principle of free labor, and slavery will be brought to an end by carrying out this resolution in practice. We here highly resolve. Lincoln asks his listeners on the battlefield to love their country for what it is going to be. The sacrifice we make on behalf of a future serves as corroborating proof of our greatness. There's a degree of self-deception in this, but it declines to cover its tracks. One reason why he was called honest. Lincoln doesn't hide the slave constitution under his prayer for freedom. The imperfections of the former city are confessed between the lines, but fulfillment of the prayer is trusted to show that the Constitution all along was pointed in the direction of the fight to make the Union free. Notice that the logic of the argument for the exceptional city by Pericles has been reversed here. The corrupt past, exceptional in its reliance on slavery, is salvaged by reference to a purified future where through the unexampled sacrifice of nameless thousands, the same nation will become exceptional by overcoming slavery from within. The argument would be plainer but less effective if Lincoln hadn't begun with an allusion to a deep past, 77 years ago. We would be less liable to be wrongly moved if the speech had begun 2 years from now, perhaps 3, our country will see a great transformation. But an exceptional character, whether in history or story, needs an exceptional plot. And so the speech begins with its biblical cadence, evoking the length of life of one man, and asks the implicit question, can we as a free people survive longer than this, the lifespan of one man? Finally, the exceptionalism of the nation is family. People sometimes say that they treat their country, my people, the way they treat members of their family. If the nation does wrong, it is an error and not a crime, or anyway, we can't help seeing it in that softer light. And the reason is that we owe our nation, as we owe our children, unconditional love. I pass over the obvious difficulties about the truth of the analogy, the appropriateness of it. A family has cradled us, if you will, nested us, nursed us from infancy, and we may have done the same for later generations of the same family. And this, in a sense, far more intimate than the sense in which a nation can be said to have fostered or somehow nurtured us. We know our family with an individuated depth and subtlety we can't bring to our knowledge of the nation. This may be a difference of kind or a difference of degree only, but the difference is certainly great. Turn last to a subtler piece of the same delusion. What do we mean by unconditional love? What do we mean by it even as applied to a member of a family? Suppose my delinquent child robs an old man on a city street, and I learn of it by accident or his own confession. What exactly do I owe him, my child? Unconditional love in this setting surely does mean that I can't stop caring about my child. Unless he's a monster through and through, I will regard this terrible act as an aberration in him, and I won't be able to stop thinking about the act and the actor, quite differently from the way I would think about such a crime if anyone else committed it. Does unconditional love, though, also require that I make excuses for him? Shall I pay a lawyer to get him off the hook and back on the streets as soon as possible? Is it my duty to conceal what he's done if there's a chance of keeping it secret, and never speak the truth about what he did and why he did it in the company of strangers or persons outside the family, in the newspapers of other nations? The argument for exceptionalism as a form of unconditional love does, I think, follow this train of bad insinuation all the way to the end. It suggests that we ought to protect our country from the misunderstanding of strangers, which may amount to the same thing as the right understanding of justice. This appeal to the nation as family rests on a reversion from moral argument to acknowledged sentiment. It may be a less fertile source of blamable pride than the exceptionalism of my country right or wrong. It may be less deceptive, too, than the exceptionalism that asks us to love our country for ideals which have never properly been translated from resolution to practice. And yet, in this last resort of exceptionalism, like a family is my nation, there is the same renunciation of concern with justice, a renunciation that, if followed, would mark the end of any social order beyond that of the family and its extension, the tribe. Unconditional love of our country is the counterpart of unconditional detachment or even hostility toward others. And where it leads will be clear enough from what I've said thus far. None of us is an exception, and no nation is. The sooner we come to live with this truth as a mundane reality without exception, the more grateful other people and other nations will be to live in a world that includes us among others. Thank you.
I'm coming up here not to be an isolationist, but rather to keep myself energized and you awake. I very much enjoyed your remarks, Professor Bromwich. We looked over the topic, and I'll ask it again. Is American exceptionalism a force for moral good, right? And as I was thinking how to address it, I thought that in each case one must remind oneself how one defines exceptionalism. When we talk about it, as you have been past 24 hours, it often means interventionist, neocon, right? Going in places as if you were better. We think we are better, or our institutions are better, so we could intervene. Deeds of war, right, as to which David referred. But that's not always the case. Sometimes American exceptionalism goes a different way. And I want to talk about one period on our history when it went a different way, and I'm grateful for this time to Roger and this program. The example that came to mind for me was the 20s, and the president then, very obscure, probably not often mentioned here, Coolidge from the 20s, 1923 to 1929, whose presidency was the topic of a recent bio I wrote of him. Coolidge grew up in New England. It's hard to find a president with a greater faith in one kind of American exceptionalism, going straight back to the city on a hill concept. I'm going to read you a Coolidge line so you can get a feel for his exceptionalism. His, I would say, Calvinism. It was no accident his first name was Calvin. The people in their family were named thus: Calvin, Luther, or Oliver. In the fullness of time, America was called into being under the most favorable circumstances to work out the problem of a more perfect relationship among mankind, among people. That was his concept, and he truly believed in it. He went to the Edwards Church, that is the Jonathan Edwards Church, and you know that Jonathan Edwards, too, spoke of a version of the city on a hill. So he's the real deal and steeped in it, and much closer to the revolution, the American Revolution, than we might be in the original Arbella that came over and the original conception of our country's founders, right? So he sort of lived it and talked their language. And what I'll tell you now is that he had a specific exceptionalism, and it yielded some surprising results, mostly domestically. He represented that Vermont farmer, the guy who goes his own way, kind of independent, to which President Botstein just referred. So I'll tell you his story, and then I'll tell you what that says about exceptionalism. He grew up in Vermont in a very small town where you had to feel exceptional to want to stay. It was a farming town, but later the agriculture department determined that not a single acre of the town was arable. So that means you're farming for the idea of farming. You're a very idealistic people. And then he went down the valley, the Connecticut River, right, towards us, but not all the way, and stopped at Amherst and went to college. And you probably know, or maybe have heard, that Amherst was not founded to teach music or poetry or history even. It was founded to train clergymen, the poorer kind, as many of these schools were. Eventually they came to do these other things, but that's where it was founded. And I just for last night looked up what Coolidge would have found in the 1891 course book, which is the year he entered. The college, definition of the college by the college. The college, while not sectarian, is distinctly Christian, right? That's what he grew up. You look, the promotion of the religion of Christ was the special object of the undertaking of the university, okay? And you go over, say, to Smith or Holyoke. I'll read you from some other 1809 course books from the 5 college area. It is a Christian college conducted in the belief that Christian faith is the true source of highest culture. All education should be in the glory of God. That's what, whether they went to Smith, Amherst, UMass Amherst, which did exist, a farming school, that's what they heard at that point. And the motto of Amherst is, let them illuminate the world. That is, we are bright, so we can illuminate. So we are a city on a hill. Very directly. Missionaries, a lot of missionaries came out of Amherst. Not many Catholics, not many Jews at that time, right? Not many anybody's but Protestants. Live by example. Coolidge had a very interesting class. He had a friend named Dwight Morrow at Amherst, and Coolidge went to be a lawyer, and Dwight went to Wall Street, was a lawyer, and he had another friend named Harlan Stone who became a lawyer and then taught at Columbia. And he stuck with his crowd, so they stuck with the ideas they got in college about what they were supposed to do in the world. And you can follow Coolidge all along his career. The first part of his career was as a Massachusetts politician. He was the mayor of Northampton, Mass., where Smith is, and then he was a state lawmaker going all the way up. And this is the way he wrote. Always about doing things, but also always about the idealism, which is related to the exceptionalism. You can't be exceptional unless you have an idea of it, right? So you might have heard that Coolidge was a very economic president. He said the chief business of America is business. He also said the chief ideal of America, it's not business, is idealism. The two have to go hand in hand. And when he did become president, he came to Washington with Warren Harding as vice president. Harding unfortunately died, so Coolidge did become president. He gave an address about the United States in Philadelphia around July 4th. I believe it was July 5th because July 4th was a Sunday, and they were so religious they didn't do things like speeches on Sunday. And he quoted John Wise and said, "Democracy is Christ's government." Very serious oldie-timey. Well, the Constitution should be respected, but the ultimate sanction of law rests on the righteous authority of the Almighty. Behind the Constitution there is, he would say, natural law. He doesn't apologize. There's no relativizing. He won't say, we have our system and they have theirs. He wouldn't agree with President Obama when President Obama did that. And he also said, the higher our standards, the greater our progress, the more we do for the world. How did this come out in policy, though? That's the interesting part. There had been a rough time, World War I. There had been the Red Scare. You've heard of that in the early 20s. That was President Wilson. He and Harding, and at this period when these two Republicans, Harding and Coolidge, come in, they are the Progressive Party, because the Republicans at that time were the Progressive Party. What's progressive at home? Well, you have magnanimity, as you probably know. Harding was the one to commute the sentence of the Eugene Victor Debs, right? They treated the radicals most of the time, but not always, more gently than had happened in the preceding period. They called for comity at home. They restricted immigration. You can approve or disapprove of that. I tend to disapprove. But their argument for it was America needs to find its own exceptionalism at home, and we can't do that with so many people coming in. That was their case. Coolidge said that once you were here, you were included and to be welcome. He said whether one came over on the Mayflower or just a couple years ago in steerage, these two people were all in the same boat together in the United States now. So he focused on comedy and integration at home, but he did support limiting immigration. That is, he thought America was precious and needed protecting as a model. Most of his focus about this exceptionalism was economic. His idea of economic exceptionalism, of living up to our high living standards and sustaining them. If you watch on television what they say about American exceptionalism, someone like Tom Friedman of the Times will say, first off, we grow faster than other economies. Our standard of living gets better than other economies. That's our definition of American exceptionalism, and that's why it's missing now. Coolidge shared that view. So he took economic steps to make America grow fast. One of those was that they had a whole policy to make it easier for companies to hire. That was what they called normalcy. If you ever go back and study the 20s, they lowered taxes enormously. You think that only helps the right wing. In the case of the 20s, it helped to create jobs. They cut back the federal government for the sake of honoring commerce. What happened in the 20s? A beautiful decade, not like Great Gatsby, not like Boardwalk Empire. Everyone got a flush toilet, 1. 2, people began to get electricity. You go from 20, 30, 40, 50, 60% people are getting electricity. People got their first car, right? Model T and then Model A in that decade. It was a wonderful decade for the middle class. It's much maligned in that regard. We had very strong growth, our unemployment below 5%. What's the most humane thing you can do for anyone? If you're going to be humane, be sure there are jobs. There were. Then you move to foreign policy. Say one more thing about that. that was the period when America became the envy of the world economically. Before that, Britain was the envy, and you saw the money slosh over here from the United Kingdom, right? Because people suddenly saw America and the dollar might be stabler than the pound. Foreign policy, American exceptionalism. Remember, these are boys, Coolidge, his friends, they're boys who were trained basically in a former missionary school. Let them illuminate the world. Coolidge was not at all sort of temperamentally interested in foreign policy. People made fun of him. Elihu Root of the Council on Foreign Relations, where I used to work, said he didn't have an international hair on his head. He couldn't be even welcome on such a panel. What did they do? Well, they lowered interest rates to help the other side, the Europe that President Botstein was talking about. They restricted armaments here because they were anti-war. They didn't want the U.S. to build up. Coolidge signed on to that. They kept tariffs high, very controversial. People who are free market don't like that, right? Why? They wanted to protect U.S. business so it could be a model, a beacon, right? You know, you look at the foreign wars that America was kind of mired in when Coolidge came in. Coolidge's #1 idea was stay out of war, so he was hardly a neocon. Right? Stay out of war almost at all costs. There was a war in Mexico between the very left-leaning government and the Catholic Church. It was horrible and bloody. He sent his emissary, his classmate from Amherst down, Dwight Morrow, right? And Dwight Morrow did not go down to lead an incursion, right? Dwight Morrow he said, I'm going to make the Mexicans understand that we like them. I'm going to solve this with diplomacy. And what did Morrow do to solve a terrible bloody fight with diplomacy? He worked up a stunt. The stunt was, at that point, aviation was the most exciting thing going on, and Lindbergh had just crossed the Atlantic. He arranged it that Lindbergh would fly down to Mexico. They'd never seen a plane come all the way from the U.S. from Washington to Mexico, and that would show how we could all get along through this new form of transport, aviation, that would link the world. Very utopian. Well, Lindbergh did fly down. He got lost and almost perished. An hour and a half late, 200,000 people waiting in the Mexican sun. But he did fly down. There was a lot of good feeling. And as you may know, he got a girlfriend, the daughter of Dwight Morrow, Anne Morrow, and she became Anne Morrow Lindbergh and became a writer. That's a cute story. It's very nice. A lot of Catholics would say it was a papering over and we should have intervened and defended the Catholics who were being murdered in Mexico, right? So that was their approach, though. Good feeling and diplomacy rather than force. There were other areas where there was force. Coolidge wasn't happy with them, Nicaragua. You look at that. He always liked to retreat and to fight for the rule of law. He was, in fact, a UN type of president. That was his exceptionalism. And interestingly, the great foreign policy achievement, though you may criticize it, of Coolidge was the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war. That's we always mock the Kellogg. How can you outlaw war? Even at the time, people mock this pact. Everyone's arming, and we all sign a paper saying we're outlawing war. And there's a famous poem that was read aloud by a lawmaker, Hiram Johnson, from Coolidge's party, who was suspicious of this pact. He said, it's a helmless ship, a houseless street, a wordless book, a swordless sheath. This pact, it's a joke. It's an oxymoron. It cannot function. Coolidge believed that if you set the model by living the law, others would follow. Your light would illuminate the world. The regent of what we now call Ethiopia sent Coolidge a beautiful gold shield with 32 diamonds in it. It's still in Plymouth Notch, where Coolidge's house is. I've seen it. And what do you think Coolidge sent back to this tribal form of tribute? He sent back Moore's International Law Handbook. You fight with swords, I fight with laws and words, and that's what the pact was. As you probably know, Coolidge also went to Cuba on a goodwill trip. What did I take away from this? What does it say about our topic? One, on foreign policy, did this work? Well, you run the risk of being called an interventionist if you say, not really. Maybe we should have done something more for all those tens of thousands of Catholics who were murdered in Mexico by the left-leaning government, but we didn't want to get involved, right? Or maybe we should have been less naive about Kellogg-Briand Pact and understood that the prince from Ethiopia who sent us the shield would be later attacked by Mussolini under the cover of a pact like Kellogg-Briand, right? I don't have a strong view about how you evaluate U.S. foreign policy in the 30s, but I do know that the domestic exceptionalism worked. How did it work? Because America stabilized, even as the rest of the world was unstable. The growth of the 20s was very comforting. We did have normalcy, a word we often mock because it was a campaign motto. Sounds kind of dumb, normalcy. We did have normalcy. What did normalcy facilitate? Creativity in the 20s. The patent rate was through the roof. The normal, less disrupted environment gave rise to wonderful production. How do we know this? How are we reminded by this? Well, I have a lot of German relatives too, who came here, and we happen to have the letter of an auntie who made a Sherpa trip for the family from terrifying Germany under Hitler and looked around, and she wrote home, come back over, come here now if you can get a visa. It's just herrlich here, it's really nice, it's princely. Everyone in our family should move to America right away and teach at the New School. And Hannah Arendt herself, if you know her work or remember even from the movie, do you remember when how many people have seen the Hannah Arendt movie? Yeah, some, right? Remember in the classroom when the students said, maybe in English or German, what did you think when you came here, right? She said, paradise. And she said it in English. She didn't say it in German, paradise with her cigarette. A large share of that paradise was the stable, prosperous country that our policies set the stage for. And those policies included very, laissez-faire, smaller government, quiet government policies in order that creativity might flourish. So that was the exceptionalism that had definitely became a force for moral good when the rest of the world went dark. That we were that healthy, we were the beacon, we were the goal. I'm eager to talk to my colleagues and continue the conversation all together. Thank you.
Is it working? Yeah. Well, you've just heard two stimulating presentations, and Calvin Coolidge was known for his brevity. Before he was governor, he was lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, and one night he was at a dinner in Northampton with one of the local town socialites, and she asked him what he did, and he said, well, I'm the lieutenant governor. She said, oh, that sounds fascinating. You must tell me all about it. And he said, I just did. So thank you very much. I'll try to keep it brief. The other thing I have to say about, I'm so really happy to be here at Bard, and one correction to Leon Botstein is that there is another person in the room who knew Hannah Arendt and who was, maybe there's more than one, but one that I know of. Oh, well, then there's two. But the one that I was going to mention is Jerome Cohn, who spoke here yesterday. He was her faithful translator and interpreter, and a very magnanimous and brilliant interpreter of Arendt, and knew her very well. So I'm glad he's here. I am, unlike David, an American exceptionalist, but unlike Amity, I think that what capitalism has become is destroying the kind of exceptionalism I want to sustain. Huh?
I didn't say anything about now.
No, but you said a lot about capitalism and free markets. What I want to suggest is that we have a hard time in this country reconciling small r Republican virtues, the kinds of things that Leon was talking about, the kinds of forbearance, the kinds of deliberative capacities, the willingness to lose. We have a hard time reconciling that with an almost knee-jerk obeisance to a kind of neoliberal ideology, free markets. George Packer touched on this yesterday, that what starts out as good entrepreneurialism, the folksy entrepreneurialism of a Sam Walmart, becomes something rather different, a casino-like financing, consumer bamboozling economy with all the predatory lending and the tragedies that we've seen. We've been wrestling like Jacob with the angel with this from the Puritan times. The Puritans actually had something to say about it. And believe it or not, at the risk of sounding like the Protestant pastor in the synagogue, I hope to say a little something about that. Exceptionalism in a tragic sense. Who was the young woman who recited the poem at the beginning? That was a wonderful poem. She said, "This cultured hell that tests my youth." There is a kind of sense in which unconditional love involves unconditional suffering, and it's not necessarily antithetical to loving others. The unconditional love that you feel for a child need not mean that something from that doesn't radiate out to other children, except at moments. Also, I think a proper sense of self-esteem that we all think people should have, of dignity. In the blink of an eye, that can turn into aggressive self-aggrandizement and all the kinds of things we tend to associate with American exceptionalism. But there's a sense in which you can't stand up on both feet without some sense of your own uniqueness. Even if you think of us all as the bearers of Kantian universal rights, we each bear those rights through our individual biographies, experiences, bodies, conditions, and we have to weave our own contributions to that. So it's in that sense that I do think that the United States, by fortuitous circumstances, by accidents, and often sometimes despite itself, has been exceptional. Every nation is exceptional, every person is exceptional, but if exceptional means that you don't have to obey the rules, then I think I agree with David, and I think he's emphasizing that point. That kind of exceptionalism doesn't work. So there's a kind of balance that I'm looking for and that I want to speak to a little bit. Hamilton said in the Federalist Papers, and I'm not sure how seriously he meant it, he said, "History seems to have destined Americans to decide the important question whether a people can really govern itself through reflection and choice, or whether it is destined by its political makeup to go from accident to force to fraud to the kinds of things that I think we feel are happening to us a lot right now and that always have been from the very beginning." But that gamble, that Hamiltonian gamble, I'll call it that, although I think he was very skeptical that it could work, obviously is something different than founding a nation on myths of blood and soil, Blut und Boden, of that kind of unconditional love, and there I agree. And we need to acknowledge all the hypocrisies, as someone said yesterday, the genocidal, the slavery, all the things that have kept us from taking that gamble honestly, that we could govern ourselves by reflection and choice. But what's amazing to me, what is worth remarking about the country, is not the genocide and the slavery, which is everywhere and ubiquitous, and name me a nation that hasn't been founded on murdering and forcibly incorporating and doing all kinds of things to people that are now regarded as French or now regarded as one thing or another. It's not that, even though that has to be faced. It's the extent to which we have continually tried to push against that and to insist that we are about this gamble of governing ourselves through reflection and choice and all the civic republican virtues that go with that, the things, again, that President Botstein was illuminating. Now, I teach a course at Yale called Global Journalism, National Identities. And it's a potpourri about how can you have a civic republican or liberal democratic public sphere in the context of any national identity anymore, given all the things that I don't have to enumerate. The revolutions in capital, in technology, in communications, and in migrations, and in popular, and the mixing. but I used in class the other day, I wish I had had time to set it up for projection. This is a copy of China Daily. It's a newspaper that is distributed essentially by the government of China through a supposedly independent corporation on every newsstand in Manhattan, every of those green coin boxes that you see. And here we have in the, I was holding it upside down, I'm sorry. Here we have on the front page, on the top, a big story about the demonstrations in Hong Kong. This is not journalism, it's essentially a communique from the government. It talks about the leaders of Hong Kong and Beijing urging the protesters, it says, occupiers urged to reflect. And what are they urged to reflect about? The way they're blocking traffic and preventing government from functioning and so on. There's no discussion of what they are occupying the area for, of what's intended. This is an official government communique disguised as a news story. The next news story at the bottom is about how a Chinese investment firm has just bought the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Manhattan and a number of other American properties and corporations that are being bought. Stephen Schwartzman, a classmate of mine from Yale, who is head of the Blackstone Group and now has begun this multi-million-dollar Schwartzman Scholarship Program in China, was asked why he began it, because a Chinese government-owned entity bought out part of Blackstone for $300 billion. Now, why do I mention these things? That's one kind of nationalism that's on the rise and that is using our First Amendment. Antonin Scalia can't object to this. He can't object to the fact that China Television, CCTV, has begun operation in the United States for Americans with American broadcasters, giving us the news in the same way that CNN or Murdoch do to people in other nations, but they are blocked in China, aren't they? Or Bloomberg when they try to tell honest news. But China Television is here using our First Amendment and our openness to do that. And, you know, we assume sunlight is the best disinfectant, and probably in these cases it's true. I don't think China Daily or China Television is going to do a lot of damage to the American public sphere. But neither are they going to tell you anything about what's going on in Hong Kong, what's at stake there, and how anybody, not even from a specifically American point of view, should regard what's going on there. Now, if neither the First Amendment nor our own commitment to global capital, to free markets, offers us any defense against these buyouts and this kind of distortion, where are we? And there I come back to Packer's point yesterday at the extent to which the horses of capitalism and American nationalism no longer pull together as they did in Henry Luce's American Century essay, the famous essay that he wrote in 1941, I guess, when we were, you know, making the world safe for democracy again. And there was an assumption that those two horses could pull together, that free markets and Republican virtue went together. They don't. Free markets, as what they have become, would horrify Adam Smith, they would horrify John Locke. You let me finish and then you'll comment during the comment section. And they would really have a problem reconciling what global capital is now, in which you call up the Ford Motor Company and ask if Calvin Coolidge called up the Ford Motor Company and asked, are you an American company? They would say, no, we're not. Because we found out that we can make cars $1,200 cheaper in Canada because they have national health insurance. We don't have to pay national health benefits. Who knows what global capital means, except it means an evisceration of Republican sovereignty. And I would argue, through the casino-like financing and consumer bamboozling, it erodes Republican virtues, small r Republican virtues. Not talking about partisan parties, because Democrats are just as implicated in all of this. I'm really not drawing that partisan distinction here. So where does that leave us is really my question, and I've used up more than half my time just getting to that. And I really wanted to actually talk about something, and I'll just say a few words about it. I hate it when people get up here and say, in my book, in my book, in my book. So I won't say that, but what I'm about to just try and summarize very briefly is coming out in the winter issue of Democracy Journal. Some of you may know it, it's that quarterly journal. And maybe I'll provide it to Roger. Anyone who wants to read the essay can do it. So I'll just say a few words about it here as a way of broaching the topic. And then really, when my time has expired, just let me know. The current wisdom, call it neoliberal, call it whatever you want, is that the world is flat. And the kids at Yale thrive on that. The kids that I teach are part of a career networking center and a cultural galleria for a global managerial elite that no longer answers to any particular polity or moral code. Not all of them, but that is the increasingly dominant ethos. It's what they're being drawn into. And the founders of Yale and Harvard and most of the other colleges that Amity mentioned, you mentioned Amherst and the others, they insisted that the world isn't flat. They said the world has abysses that open suddenly at our feet and in our hearts. And that the precursor of our liberal education, their education, of course, was theological, as Amity said very rightly. Its purpose was to give people the resources and coordinates to plumb those abysses, to face the demons in them, and if necessary, to defy established earthly powers on behalf of a higher one. Now, we don't want to go there. And I understand that because we know all the wrong that's been done in the name of that. But we can use that history to emphasize the questions that go unanswered when we find ourselves defenseless we find that our armies and our capital and our liberal procedural rights are not enough to protect us from what's rising. Although Puritan hypocrisy and repression, with which I'm well familiar, showed that religion is very odious when it becomes institutionalized in rulers, their very same intensity, their insistence that a public position had to be based on inner integrity, on some kind of soulful decision-making, that sparked insurgencies by Puritans themselves. Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson, for whom the Hutchinson Parkway is named, incidentally, and a story in itself. Without some kind of depth of personal witness against seemingly insuperable odds on behalf of a cause larger than oneself, it's hard to imagine Nathan Hale, a 23-year-old Yale graduate in 1776, defying the only legitimate government of his time on behalf of a nascent republic. Or John Adams writing Puritan premises into the preamble of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Dwight MacDonald, descendant of two Puritan presidents of Yale, Timothy Dwight, both of them, grandfather and grandson. His name Dwight was named for them. These are people who, he was defying the republic that Nathan Hale had died for. He was defying what it had become in some ways as a critic. Other bearers of Puritan defiance included, well, Lincoln. And I mean, in some ways, he certainly was awash in those Calvinist tropes of dealing with earthly power in reference to a higher one. He told Harriet Beecher Stowe, another descendant of Puritans, the daughter of Lyman Beecher, that her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin had started the Civil War, and Martin Luther King picked up more than a little Calvinist theology. His theology was not liberal when, as a student at Boston University. At my Yale commencement in 1969, the university chaplain, William Sloane Coffin, was leading resistance to the Vietnam War. And he gave up and gave a benediction that said, "Help us to free the oppressed, O Lord, in such a way that the oppressors too are free." He was defying the republic in the name of, or defying U.S. government in the name of a civic republican nation that, for his purposes, were rooted in a theology that we might not share, but whose respect for the living American republic we might share. So these are some of the issues that I go after in some depth in what I wanted to present, but don't have time to present. Let me just suggest that unless we find a way to reopen those abysses, open those questions. American exceptionalism will be as vapid and as hypocritical as David rightly depicts it as being, and that we won't do it through markets and wealth, indispensable and essential though they are. And I will conclude with this sentence. A liberal capitalist republic, in my view, has to rely ultimately on its citizens' voluntary willingness to uphold certain public virtues and beliefs that neither the liberal state alone nor markets reinforce or defend. The liberal state can't do it because it's not supposed to judge between one way of life and another. It's supposed to remain neutral in certain ways. Markets can't do it because their very genius is that they approach individuals as self-interested consumers and investors. Therefore, the citizens of a republic have to be nurtured somehow all the more intensively, and we can't look to the right or the left to do it. Thank you.
My remarks will be brief because they are, it will be quite difficult to address the panelists as a group, but I would like to suggest that the audience, in framing their questions for the panelists, think back on what President Botstein suggested as truly being exceptional and that about America still, and that is that it is a place of experimentation and immigrancy. And whether, I guess I would want to ask David Bromwich whether he thinks it's possible through some kind of, as Jim Sleeper has a phrase, energetic pedagogy, and we could think of maybe public institutions as forums where this might happen, as a kind of new Lyceum movement, opening discussions of a sort that haven't happened except at places like the Arendt Center here, whether it's possible to shift our idea of what exceptionalism is from an ism, again, as something fixed and given and providential, to the ongoing process of what the democracy had been thought to be, certainly by Lincoln and certainly by the founders, and what are the kinds of questions we would have to, I mean, Jim Sleeper suggested that we frame certain questions that need to be answered in order to remoralize that project, in order to activate the project of exceptionalism, not take it as a given, not think that we're better because we're just, but to reflect back on what the plot of the Constitution was. You talked about the exceptionalism as part of the plot. And I think that it's an accident that the New World was discovered. It's an accident that we found ourselves where we did in this place without the adequate language, without the English language. I think it's Walt Whitman points out, you know, how can a language devised on a rocky island in the middle of the North Sea deal with the expanse, the vastness, the extraordinary diversity? It's incommensurate. That language, that syntax, that grammar does not work for this experience. So I think part of and unless I misunderstood, wasn't Coolidge's presidency, didn't it lead right up to the crash? And I mean, so I'm taking it that your argument is
my argument is that
as a
negative. Post hoc ergo propter.
Ah, I see. So the past doesn't.
Well, I wrote. I'm not going to mention what I wrote because that would be vanity. But I wrote a history of the 30s first. That is also. But that's another. So it's a. I don't think responding to the jab would be productive for exceptionalism.
Okay. And yeah,
unless you'd like me to.
I did very much appreciate the recuperation of Jonathan Edwards, and I think that it's possible to remind ourselves that Edwards had a very active sense of what Christian and moral excellence was, and that the excellence was always, and this is actually the seed of what becomes Peircean and Jamesian pragmatism. The excellence is of improving our lot one step at a time, individual by individual, and participating in a democracy. So again, that's an active concept and not a given that we are better. And with that, I think we should open it to the audience and, or maybe to our panelists, one to the other, or
I'm
think
happy
I'll
to
leave
open it to the audience.
I'll leave it to the
Could I just say
moderator.
one
I'll
thing?
leave it to my colleague, Uday
Yeah,
too.
Amity, you want to say?
I just wanted to say one thing. The reason I sat up when Jim talked about capitalism is there is a distinction between capitalism and cronyism.
There used to be.
There is, and what Mr. Sleeper is suggesting that is happening in Mr. Schwartzman firm. He's suggesting it's cronyism. That is, we all get along sometimes for tribal or long-term business reasons that are not directly marketsy or capitalism. In productive capitalism, when you do business with someone, you do it so well and with such frankness and honesty that he or she wants to do business with you again, and it's not all hidden powers in back rooms. So whether capitalism and democracy go together is one thing. Whether cronyism and democracy go together, it seems to me more relevant. The trouble most of us have with China is that not only do they not allow our newspapers or television, but their business also isn't truly business. Often, their markets are rigged. So I would be careful whether about calling it all capitalism like that. Many capitalists, including Coolidge, would not call what happens in China capitalism. Okay, so
All right. Let's open it up for questions from the audience. I think there's a mic.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sean McMeekin from the History Department here. I have a question for both Jim and Amity, kind of different versions of the same question pursuant to your presentations. Jim, you made an eloquent case about what we might call the wandering loyalties of capital, and also the job horizons of our elites at places like Yale, that is the lack of the loyalty to the country. Flipping that around from the capital side, what would your approach be to the labor question regarding particularly immigration and what we might call the rather open lobbying for certain policies on the part of certain billionaires, Mark Zuckerberg most famously, that is regarding the movement of labor. Amity, I mean, just to put it as bluntly as possible, what would Silent Cal say if the question were either the ongoing border crisis, the kind of the Mexican, all the controversies there, or the Ebola virus? What position would he take regarding quarantines and travel bans? I'm just curious, what would Silent Cal say or do?
Mine will be shorter because it's Silent Cal. I'm not sure I would agree. I don't really have a position. But if Silent Cal were here, he would close the border. For the Ebola crisis, he would, again, he would, the impulse in that period that would be fix us here first before turning outside. Now, he might send missionaries, that is hospitals, Red Cross. He was a big, big fan of what he would call charity work, and we would call, we would do it with the state. But they marshaled millions and millions when there was a crisis. He was very involved in the earthquake in Japan in the 20s, for example. So he didn't ignore crises. Those who would malign him suggest he did, but he emphasized that the in-between sector, Red Cross then, which had a relationship with government, was not government, should do it, and that significant resources should go to that. They take tithing seriously, right? They were taxed less, but they tithed more, people of that period. They gave too. So it's not as though money isn't flowing, it's just a different kind of money. Herbert Hoover, the same, rescued Belgium, right? Fed Belgium. So charity, yes, but I would guess, would that his attorney were here, that Coolidge would close the borders.
Well, we are proud of being a nation of immigrants, and of course my own grandparents were immigrants, and so there's no question about where that lies in our hearts. But it's true that the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, which is of course very conservative in terms of its market theology, wants a constitutional amendment that will read, "There shall be open borders." So you can talk about immigration as feeding cheap labor or feeding capital in certain ways, which are both good and problematic. There are definite problems. One thing I'll say on that is The Economist magazine had a fascinating issue about 2 years ago on the convergence of state capitalisms, Asian and American. And that's our problem, which is that much as we don't like the way China does business, its cronyism and corruption, how different are we? How are we becoming? We are, you know, Yale's merger with Singapore, it's been all too smooth in ways that we are not liberalizing them, they are teaching certain things to our elites that I am not happy about as a civic republic. So immigration can play both ways. It can play into things that are not what our romantic and my romantic beliefs or images are.
Yes.
Yeah. So some of those who've been most radically dissatisfied with American political culture have just left. And particularly, if we think about the examples of, say, Henry James, T.S. Eliot, or Raymond Goyce going to finding their groove more in a more stratified English society. And I'm wondering what role something like loyalty can play in helping us to better understand the American project, and I think especially of why it is that thinkers like an early pragmatist such as Royce or Hirschman have been so insistent on saying that loyalty is something important. And I'm wondering if loyalty is still important in the 21st century.
I didn't, by anything I argued, mean to suggest that groups of Americans shouldn't undertake the reform of abuses in America, that communities shouldn't repair what's gone wrong within communities, or that the country itself shouldn't, perhaps if it continues to be possible, treat itself as a whole and desire to come up to its stated ideals. I don't think we should talk about ourselves so much. I don't think we should rehearse, recite, recall for the world's edification and our own delusion stories of ourselves. I mean, that gets you to the point that George W. Bush reached when he said, somewhere in 2002, why do they hate us? We're good. And a much longer and more reasoned version of the same sentiment came from President Obama in his Nobel Prize speech, where the whole history of the United States engagement with the world since 1945 was treated as a history of benevolence and generosity, with self-interest as a kind of parenthesis, and where the deaths caused by wars engaged in by the United States were barely mentioned. Only our own suffering and sacrifice was the topic. That's the kind of thing I'm against, and that's the usual understanding of sort of patriotism that blasons its own name. Loyalty obviously is necessary. I'd prefer to use the maybe more disinfected word trust, because trust has to be earned, and I think loyalty, by the common usage of it, doesn't exactly have to be earned. Members of a criminal gang are loyal to each other, but members of a reforming community bent on a certain path learn to trust each other. Those are obviously virtues, but I don't put loyalty at all on a level with justice. They just don't belong to the same family. Loyalty is not a moral virtue. It's a non-moral strength among people.
Yes.
Thank you all so much for speaking today. Mr. Bromwich, you talked about how Athens had Athenian exceptionalism, Lincoln had his own form of that, and how they both had their incentives and reasons for calling themselves exceptional. Ms. Shlaes, you talked about how America had Christian exceptionalism. And while I was listening to all of your speeches, it came to me that countries that call themselves exceptional tend to correlate with doing relatively decent things. In the year 2014, what does America find that makes us exceptional? Or I guess a better question is, what should they find that makes us exceptional? Unless the answer is that that a country is only truly exceptional, or I guess greater, when it doesn't call itself exceptional. But if that's true, I guess you have an easier answer, but do you think your examples would have done any of the great things they did without proclaiming themselves exceptional? And for the future, should we look down upon people or countries that do? And how do we express those to ourselves or countries outside of this conference, just talking about it outside this conference? Thank you.
Let me make a fast, hair-splitting set of distinctions and leave my co-panelists to make larger points. When you say that countries that do great things tend to be the countries that regard themselves as exceptional, again, I'm afraid I think the word great is tricky here, like the word loyalty. Do you mean great good things or great bad things, or just anything great's better than anything not great, right? Certainly, Germany under Bismarck, and Germany under the Kaiser, and Germany under Hitler was trained to regard itself as poised for greatness and achieving greatness. It did, on one understanding of the word, great things, but we would mostly now say, especially in the 20th century, great bad things. There's a novel by Henry Fielding you might like to read called Jonathan Wild. It's the history of a great criminal, and it all turns on uses of this word greatness. He already saw it coming in the 18th century. My idea of, this gets back to Roger Berkowitz's reiterated question yesterday, what are we fighting for? What should we be struggling toward? I think the hardest struggle for the United States in the post-war, post-World War II period, when we have been the most powerful country in the world, and in some ways the exemplary country for other nations, the hardest thing for us would be to join the world of nations. And I don't see us coming much closer to that, though under Obama we talk more about it than we did under the previous couple of presidents. To join the world of nations as the most visible among others, but not the unequal and superior among others. I mean, and that seems to me to take a more than rhetorical effort on matters like the Kyoto Protocol, for one.
You asked whether, maybe the most exceptional thing is to stop talking about exceptionalism. I didn't quite get the point, but I think what's exceptional about this country is very elusive. It has a thin gossamer quality. When I said before that neither markets nor the liberal state really give a liberal capitalist republic enough to rely on, what is enough to rely on is what civil society does. And that's the thing about this country that was or has been the most attractive, that constant weaving of relationships and obligations so that the republic comes to depend on what the good things that people do when nobody's looking, when it's not all the lawyers and it's not all the mob scene, the general will in great expression. It's a kind of a culture that's elusive, and trying to get one's fingers on that is, I think, what makes us exceptional. This kind of gathering, in both its diversity and its complexity, is not going on in a lot of other countries, and that's exceptional.
Yes, down here in the middle.
How can we reconcile lamenting conformity and homogeneity, saying that it's an American thing to celebrate excellence and greatness, with complaining about material inequality and advocating the redistribution of wealth?
Yes.
So, well, not everyone advocates the redistribution of wealth, right? So, at least not by the government. I think your question goes with the preceding question, which is, how can we be, if we should be, exceptional? and that is to remain a place not of redistribution, but of opportunity. To have Yes, it is a contradiction. It is a contradiction. I mean, they're both impulses inside most humans. So, and you do have to choose. If greatness isn't being like Hitler, let's say the good kind of greatness, the trust kind of greatness, not the loyal kind, greatness of achievement, often, let's say, material achievement or innovation. Remember, I talked about patents in the 20s. President Botstein prizes creativity very much, an opportunity for individual and flourishing and all that, and differences. Opportunity, that's the thing you should focus on, and then worry, in my view, less on redistribution. Redistribution stifles us and makes us less exceptional and more like Europe.
This question really was addressed to, I think we should acknowledge that this question really was addressed to President Botstein, and unfortunately he's not here to answer it. He did appeal to those two apparently irreconcilable goods. I think he would say, if he were here, and this is a little easier than saying what Calvin Coolidge would say, that his main point was about democracy, and that although economic equality is not built into the necessities of political democracy, when the degree of economic inequality becomes too great, becomes monumental and stupendous, then, unless you think that money is not a form of power, such vast inequality imperils democracy. Okay? So you can, no doubt, entities like the Renaissance city-states, Florence, Venice, and so on, produced great works of art, and not just cuckoo clocks, by indulging an aristocratic order and repeating aristocratic dynasties that enforced great inequality. One kind of human excellence is promoted that way, but there are more than one or two kinds of excellence. Some forms, and this is Jim Sleeper's constant message, forms of civic excellence depend on a much higher degree of equality than the Renaissance city-states had.
Just one point about that. To draw an analogy to an individual, just like every individual, at least those who are well, every society walks on 2 feet. And let me put it this way. The left foot, call it the left foot, is the foot of social provision, of the village that raises the child, of public schooling. And without that left foot of the village that raises the child, the virtues that conservatives cherish, civic Republican virtues too, could not flourish without that. But you also walk on a right foot of irreducibly personal responsibility and autonomy. There are times when nobody else will pick you up off the floor but yourself. And without that foot, all the best social engineering will reduce people to clients or cogs or cannon fodder or worse. So when you're walking along on a healthy stride, you don't notice that at any given instant all of your weight is on the left foot and the other foot, or one foot and the other foot is off the ground swinging forward and one foot is grounded. Partisans who cling just to one foot or the other and say this is the only important foot hobble the society's stride. So you've got to have both the social provision and the irreducibly personal responsibility.
All right, let's maybe take 2 more questions. Yes, the gentleman there.
It seems to me that one of the principles of the Constitution was that we would not become too concentrated in any one area, and it split up the power between the 3 branches of government. Unfortunately, I think concentration of power happens in other sectors, namely the private sector, where industry after industry, the tendency is for corporate consolidation to occur, and that generates oligarchs. It's happened with, say, Bill Gates. It happens in media. And I think that's particularly unfortunate because we get news that's a little bit biased. I think it also generates the business cycle, so that in 1929, there was great income inequality, and all of a sudden everything breaks down. It's happening again. And the banks now are more consolidated than they ever were, larger than when they last failed. We're going to have it again. So I guess that's
That's a common
question. I'm not sure where the question goes, but
Can I?
a graduated income tax would damp down income inequality significantly, as would a good, strong inheritance tax. So that would be my solution. What do you think?
It's a wonderful point. I was thinking, well, there's another German-speaking immigrant in the room, but besides Hannah, and it is Josef Schumpeter, who focused on big concentrations of power, right? But he also noticed, as you just did, what happened to big concentrations of power. They turn out to be really fragile. Bill Gates did not turn out to be the guy, right? Actually, Mr. Brin did. Right? We were wrong about Microsoft being as powerful as we thought it would be. If we had sat here 10 years ago and said how powerful Microsoft was, predicting forward, we would be wrong. And into that space also stepped Google and the search engines, or now Twitter, right? Things we never would have imagined would have the market capacity of Microsoft are beginning to compete with it. When they get too big, when something gets too big, it fails. But what you're getting at, and I would tend to agree with it, is that there's an error here, which is the rescue of the big. Too big to fail doctrine of 2008. Many of us think it was wrong. We should have let them go. It would have been terrible, but the recovery might have been better. If you say that something big has to be rescued, then indeed something big is evil. But right? But if you say let them go with, then they will tend to fall of their own accord. Giants often are more fragile than we think, and they do fall. That's what Schumpeter studied and showed: creative destruction, and the evidence is mighty for the argument that when something gets really big, it gets really awkward and has a fatal flaw. It just happens. So it often, without even the graduated income tax, which in fact we already have, it will fall all by itself given a little time. The problem here, and I just say underscoring the entire income distribution discussion, is the too big to fail doctrine and the rescue of 8.
All right. One, yes, in the middle there, at the back, yes. I think you're being given a mic.
Thank you. By the way, I was lucky enough to have studied under Hannah Arendt at Cornell. My question is sort of in the comparative exceptionalism area, if there is such a thing. If we're looking at the positive side and the negative side on a worldwide basis and historically, we could look back to England at its peak as a colonial power, and France similarly, then more recently the German period and the Japanese, and in our current period we're seeing the Chinese and their views and their exceptionalism. India under Modi, you're hearing this among Indians now, we are the greatest nation in the world and we will show them, and even under Putin in Russia. How does American exceptionalism compare or fit in to this line of exceptionalisms? David?
Well, it would be nice to think that we're less vulgar than Putin and Modi. Maybe I should grant you that. On the other hand, neither of them is at present bombing 7 countries, as we...
All right, I think we should, on that accurate note, we should end
Talk
and
to you later.
thank our panelists.